Well, the sermon series is Epic Fail that's coming up, and Mike will be up here in just a moment. But first, you need to see this video.
'Cause you had a bad day, you're taking one down, you sing a sad song just to turn it around. You say you don't know, you tell me don't lie, you work on a smile and you go for a ride. You had a bad day, the camera don't lie, you're coming back down and you really don't mind. You had a bad day, you had a bad day. Well, you need a blue sky holiday. The point is they laugh at what you say, and I don't need no care and home. You had a bad day, you're taking one down, you sing a sad song just to turn it around. You say you don't know, you tell me don't lie, you work on a smile and you go for a ride. You had a bad day, the camera don't lie, you're coming back down and you really don't mind. You had a bad day.
I just want to clarify, someone asked after the first service, that was not me on the little yoga ball. That was me on the skateboard at the end. You didn't know I was that flexible, did you? No, good morning, everybody. My name is Mike King, and I'm one of the pastors here at Suburban. And as Rick mentioned, this morning we're starting off a new teaching series that we're calling Epic Fail. And I mean, you see it in those videos, right? An epic fail is a term that's been around for a while. We all make mistakes and screw things up sometimes that just the word mistake doesn't really cover it. It's too humiliating, it's too embarrassing, it's too whatever. So you have to kind of coin this term, this epic failure has been had. And shows like America's Funniest Videos can be on the air for like decades because all of us do this, right? We have these epic failures, and there's just a little part of most of us that enjoys watching other people suffer like that. Partially because I think we look at that and think, I am so glad that's not me. Well, when I think about the idea of an epic failure, there is actually a book of the Bible that comes to mind for me, and it's the book of Judges. And I'd like to actually invite you guys to go ahead and turn with me in your Bible to the beginning of the book of Judges now. If it would help you for any reason, you can find a red Bible in those seats around you. You can turn there, and we'll go ahead, and that way we can all be on the same page. But if you think about it, the book of Judges is part of the history books of the Old Testament. It tells the history of the people of Israel. And unlike those videos, there is really nothing funny about the epic failures that we see in the book of Judges. It is a dark time in the history of the people of Israel. The book really does record just this catalog of one mistake, one epic failure after another. But it really, as you read through these stories, and as they just get worse and worse as the book goes on, you're just reminded of the incredible brokenness of people. And it's really difficult to read these stories and see the pain and the suffering and the violence that a person is able to inflict on another. I mean, if you read all the way through this book, you read stories of murder and ethnic cleansing, of rape and sexual violence, of spousal and child abuse. I mean, it is not an easy book to read. It's one of those things, you read through it and you're just reminded of how broken we are. And in fact, you read these things sometimes and you think, why is this even in the Bible? Right? Why do we read stories about corpses that are dismembered with the pieces mailed out to different tribes? That happens near the end of the book. You think, why is this even in there? Well, because it's in there, I think we have to take it seriously. And if we're to ask the question, why is the book of Judges in the Bible? I think at least one of the answers is pretty simple. It's the gospel. Right? The gospel, as clearly as I know how to define it, is that every single one of us, we are all more broken than we will ever know. But we are also more loved by God than we can ever imagine. Right? That's kind of the truth of the Bible right there. We are more broken than we can ever know, but are also more loved by God than we can ever imagine. And I think the book of Judges, at least in part, is in the Bible because it reminds us of the truth of the gospel, and it reminds us of our need for the gospel. Right? It reminds us of the truth of it, right? Because we just see the incredibly damaging things that broken people do to each other. We're all more broken than we can ever know. But it also reminds us of this never giving up on us kind of love that God has for us that we see in page after page of the New Testament, the Old Testament, and even in the book of Judges as well. And it's interesting because as you read through the book of Judges, there's lots of stories about people that show up and do things, but very few of them are what we would consider kind of heroes, right? Most of the heroes, the people who sort of do God's work in the book of Judges, they are really broken and flawed people. And the farther you get through the book, kind of the more broken, the more screwed up, the more flawed they are. So when you read something like Judges, you're reminded that not every story is in the Bible because it is an example that we should imitate or an example that we should follow. That's really not the goal of the Bible, is to just give you a bunch of stories that we should try to imitate. No, really, the central story of the Bible is the story of a God who is merciful and who is patient and who works through broken people like you and like me to see his work get done in the world. That's really the story that the Bible is trying to teach all of us. And it's one of those things, it's as I read through this book and as I've been reading and studying it, it's just remarkable to me how much that lesson still applies to our life today. Because you read it, you think about the book of Judges, it was written 3,000 years ago. So in some ways you think, well, it can't have much to say to us today because obviously the world has changed a lot in the last 3,000 years. But unfortunately, as you read it, you are also reminded of all of the ways that the world hasn't changed all that much in the last 3,000 years. So I'm going to put a list up here on the screen. These are just some of the ideas and the topics that we read about in the book of Judges. And as you look at this, think, okay, is this coming from the Bible, or is this something that I might see on the nightly news or stories on the website? This is very present-day stuff, right? The book of Judges talks about tension between different ethnic and religious groups. It talks about people who are fighting over land and territory. Talks about this great uncertainty about the roles of men and women and power-hungry political leaders. Talks about the challenges that come when you're living in a really religiously diverse culture. There's stories of spouse abuse, child abuse. There's senseless and excessive violence. You've got stories of male political leaders who are chasing women. That doesn't sound like today, right? It really is just an example of just moral confusion kind of reigns in this book. And there's one line, one verse, a statement that shows up multiple times in the book of Judges that just kind of summarizes the book as a whole. It says, in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. Right? Another translation of that says, in those days, Israel didn't have a king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Now that sounds like today in a lot of ways. And that's why this book that was written 3,000 years ago can still speak to us today. So let me kind of set the stage for this. I mentioned that the book of Judges tells part of the history of the people of Israel. So the history of Israel, it starts at the very beginning of the Bible, where God created creation, right? And he created humanity to live in a right relationship with him and in a right relationship with each other. But because of our sinful decisions, right, because we're more broken than we're ever going to know, that relationship between us and God was shattered. And as a result, the right relationships with other people that we were created to enjoy, those were broken as well. So everything's broken. But God loves us too much to let it stay that way. So God says, I have got a solution to this problem. I'm going to start by picking out one man, Abraham. And he says, Abraham, I'm going to work through you. You're going to have a son. That son is going to grow up into be a mighty group of people. And I'm going to work through that people, the nation of Israel, to one day ultimately bring hope and rescue and redemption to the entire world. So he sort of announces that at the beginning, and the people of Israel, they start to grow. Eventually, they find themselves in slavery in Egypt, and they're there for 400 years as slaves. And then God shows up and just miraculously delivers them from slavery in Egypt, and he brings them to the edge of the promised land, right? He said, there's a land I'm going to promise to give you. This land is going to be kind of your home base, your base of operations. I'm going to bless you, and from here, you will go out and you will bless the world in my name to fix this mess. And that's where we pick up the book of Judges. So you got the first 5 books of the Bible, and you've got Joshua and Judges. And right at the end of Joshua, the people of Israel are there, and they're beginning to kind of take possession of this promised land that God has given them. In the book of Joshua, God kind of lays out, he's like, here's all where you need to go. Here's the boundaries of the land that are going to be yours. You guys need to go in. You need to take every square inch of it. And their goal in doing that was not just to have a land, but he said, as you go in, you also need to make sure that you remove any kind of influence that's going to pull you away from me. Because there were already people living in this land that had different religious traditions. They followed different gods. They saw the world very differently. They operated in a very different moral code. And God knew that if any of that influence was able to stay in the land, that those things ultimately were going to pull his people away from him. So he says, when you go into the land, there's some people in there. Make sure you do not enter into political treaties with them. Don't enter into economic relationships with them. Don't intermarry with them. Don't begin to worship their gods. Like, you need to make sure that you take every square inch of the land I want you to have, and that there's nothing in there that can distract you from me. So that's where we are, okay? So if we start looking in the very first verse of the book of Judges, that's where we are. The people begin to go in and take possession of the land. But from the very beginning, you see something. You see this pattern that the people of Israel are faithful, but they're flawed. Right? They're faithful, but they're flawed. They don't quite get it right. So look at how this starts in verse 1. So it says, after the death of Joshua, right? So Joshua has led them to the edge of the promised land. He dies. So after the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, okay, God, who should go up first to fight against the Canaanites, the people of this land? So the Lord answered, Judah shall go up. I've given the land into their hands. Okay, Judah is one of the 12 tribes of Israel. The people of Israel sort of organized in these 12 tribes. So he says, the tribe of Judah, you're going to go up first. Great. So the men of Judah then said to the Semia Knights, those are some people from another tribe. He says, hey, come up with us into the territory allotted to us against the Canaanites. And then, once we've conquered our land, in turn, we'll go with you into yours. So the Semia Knights went with them. Now, right from the beginning, right, you see that they're faithful but flawed. Because they say, okay, God, what do you want us to do? He's like, all right, I want Judah to go up and take control of the land. They're part of it. So Judah says, great. And they go and get some backup. Simeon, why don't you come with us? We'll fight together. Then when it's your turn, we'll kind of fight with you. Now, from a military point of view, that makes sense. He's like, let's get some backup, right? We don't need to go in alone. But that's not what God asked them to do. Right? God asked them to go up by themselves, I think so that they would learn the lesson that God was all they really needed. Right? Because he says, when you go into the land, you can really only take possession of it if you trust me, if you obey me, right? The other people you're fighting, they may have better technology and chariots, and we'll hear about all that. But if I'm asking you to do it, I'm going to go with you. You need to just trust that I can do in you what I'm asking you to do. But, they kind of hedge their bets. So they say, well, that's great, but we'll get some backup just in case, God needs a plan B. We've got the guys from Simeon there with us. So from the very beginning, right, they're faithful. They're doing what they're called to do, but not perfectly. They're flawed. And you continue to read in the beginning parts of this chapter about the people of Judah. It says a little bit later that they go up and they attack the city of Jerusalem, and they also take it. They put the city to the sword and they set it on fire, right? So this city, Jerusalem, that even to this day is an incredibly important city for the people of Israel. Right? This is the very first time that they take possession of it. And then you read and they keep going, and the author of Judges highlights a few people, Caleb and his daughter Aksa and Othniel, who we'll see next week. And he kind of holds them up as examples of people who faithfully do what God calls them to do. But then it's interesting because as you go through the rest of chapter 1, essentially what the author does is he walks you through this map, right? This is the land of Israel, the promised land. But he walks you from south to north and just starts talking about how as you go from south to north, the different tribes either did or did not do what it was God asked them to do. And he's just sort of kind of geographically kind of walking us through how they do that. And the interesting thing about this, the farther north you move, the more flawed the people get and the less faithful the people get. So we're moving here sort of from the south to the north. They kind of wrap things up with Judah, and Judah continues to be kind of faithful but flawed to the very end. It says that the people of Judah took possession of the hill country, but they were unable to drive the people from the plains because they had these really sweet chariots, right? They had a better military technology than what they had. And then it talks about the people of Benjamin. The people of Benjamin weren't able to drive the Jebusites out, right? God said, I want you to go with me and I want you to do this fully. But the people don't do it because they don't fully trust in him. And as a result, they leave these people in the land, the people of the plains. And the people of the plains contain groups like the Philistines, right? And if you grew up in Sunday school, right, you know the stories of the Philistines, David and Goliath, right? Goliath was a Philistine. So because of this moment, when the people of Israel choose not to fully do what God asked them to do, they leave these people in the land that are going to be a thorn in their side for generations to come. And you just keep going, you keep reading, you go to the north, right? And you get there and there's a tribe, the tribe of Joseph. They decide to enter into a treaty with someone, a political agreement, like, hey, if you'll get us into the city, we'll keep you and your family safe, even though that's not what God asked them to do. And then you read about the tribe of Manasseh, and at first they kind of try to do the fighting they need to, but they're not strong enough, so they wait until they've got some more strength, and they take control of the land. But instead of driving the people out, they're like, oh, it would be an even better idea. What if we essentially kept these people around as slaves, kind of as forced labor? I mean, that's a better economic decision than just driving these people out. Why would we send away some free labor? So you read that, right? Just over and over again. You look at the tribes, and it's this pattern. Either they don't fully trust God, they don't fully lean into his strength, or they do sort of take over their part of the land, but they kind of go with what they think is common sense. And as a result, they drive through the land, and the conquest is just very incomplete. So you get to the very end of this chapter, and you get to the last tribe, all the way to the north, the tribe of Dan. And it says that there's a group of people, the Amorites, that they're trying to drive out. And they're not able to do it at all. It says the Amorites confined the Danites up in the hill country, not even allowing them to come down into the plain, right? God had laid out the boundaries where the tribe of Dan would be, and they can't even get a fraction of it, right? So it's just an interesting thing. You look at this, and in some ways, this chapter is kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, yeah, it's kind of a pretty impressive military conquest. They took over the land. They more or less have possession of the land that God called them to do. But it's not fully what God asked them to do. They're in possession of the land, but they've got all these other people living in there that have very different religious preferences, very different practices. And those people, those practices are going to continue to be a distraction and really a damaging influence in the life of the people of Israel from there on. And that's why when you jump into chapter 2, God shows up. And it's kind of like he gives his summary statement of how things have gone so far. So he's there and sort of through a messenger, the people gather together, and he says this. He says, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land I swore to give your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. But you should not make a covenant with the people of this land. You should break down their altars, right? Get rid of their religious trappings. Look what he says. Yet you've disobeyed me. Why have you done this? I've also said, I will not drive them out before you. These people, they will become traps for you, and their gods will become snares to you. And it says, when the angel of the Lord had spoken these things to all the Israelites, the people wept aloud. Now, I kind of wonder, what were the people of Israel hoping, when they got the news, hey, God's got a message. He wants to give us an update on how we're doing. Were they expecting an attaboy, like hey, good job, you more or less did what I asked you to do? I mean, in a sense, they really have done a lot of what he asked them to do. But that's not what God says. I mean, look at the language. He says, you have disobeyed me. And that question, he's just like, guys, why have you done this? Right? What I called you to do was to drive the people out so that these other influences wouldn't be there. It wouldn't take you away from your ability to truly and fully live for me, but that's not what you did. And then God says something. He says, I'm not going to break my covenant with you. I'm not done with you. I'm not going to stop loving you. I'm not giving up on you. Right? My promises last forever. You can count on that. But your decisions have consequences. Right? The decisions that you have made to go your own way instead of listening to me, they have consequences. You have left these people in the land even though I told you not to do that. And because of that, there's an inevitable consequence of your decisions. These people will trip you up. They will gum up the works. They will mess up your life. And they will be a snare to you. And then this is really where this pattern starts. Right? There's a pattern. There's a cycle of behavior that kicks off right here that you see over and over again through the book of Judges. In fact, the whole rest of the book is kind of based around this cycle. And you see it starts out right here. I think it's in verse 10. So let's look at this together. It says this, it says, after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors. In other words, after they died, that gathering to their ancestors is kind of a reference to burial practices back in that time. So it says, after that generation, the generation that had seen God bring them, out of the wilderness, bring them into the land, when that generation had died, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Right? They'd forgotten who God was and what he had done for them. So it says, then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. Right, that's the first step in this cycle. The people forget God and they start following other gods. They start going their own way. Sometimes they forget God because everybody dies off and the new generation just didn't know. Sometimes they forget God because things are really going well. And sometimes when you're peaceful and prosperous, it's pretty easy to say, I got this taken care of. God, there's some famine in Africa. If you want to go deal with that, I've totally got it under control here. And we just forget him. We forget how much we need him. So that's the first step, right? People forget God and they sort of go down another road. And that leads to step 2, where the people become oppressed by another people group, another army. So you see that in verse 12. It says, the people aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and they served Baal, one of these other gods, and the Ashtoreths. Again, these are gods of other people. So he says, in his anger, Israel the Lord In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. In other words, to try to get the attention of his people, to try to bring them back to him, God lets the consequences of their decisions happen. He said, you left these people in the land? Okay, these people are going to put you under their thumb. They're going to oppress you. They're going to run the show for a while. And that leads to step 3, right? So they're being oppressed, so there's some distress. In verse 15, look at the end of it. It says, the people were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Okay, finally, we're a chapter and a half into the book called Judges. We finally hear the word judges. Okay, so we need to talk about what these judges are. Because if you're anything like me, the judge that you have in mind is not what God has in mind, right? I grew up, the only judges that I knew were Judge Wapner from the People's Court and Judge Judy. But this is not the kind of judge that God has in mind. It's not a judicial court kind of thing. No, the judges in the book of Judges are leaders. Oftentimes they're military leaders. They rally an army. They rally the troops and they physically lead an army to drive out the people who are oppressing God's people. And that's what happens here. God hears the people cry out in distress. He has compassion on them. He identifies a judge and raises this leader up who's going to gather an army and kind of go into battle and drive the bad guys out. And that happens. And the people are delivered and they're back in a place where they can really follow God faithfully. But it never lasts. It never lasts. Look at what it says here in verse 18. It says, whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and their stubborn ways. Right? So this is the pattern that defines the book of Judges from here on out. Right? The people follow another god. They're unfaithful. They move away from God. And as a result, they're put under the oppression of another group of people. They're sort of punished. They're living in oppression. And they don't like that, so they cry out to God for mercy. And God, because he loves them, because he's promised to continue to never give up on them, he raises up a judge who delivers them. And then that deliverance leads to kind of a better season. And that better season leads to them to forget God, which leads to their oppression, which leads to them crying out, which leads to a judge, which leads to their deliverance, which eventually leads them to forget God once again. And this cycle, from here on out, this is the cycle that dominates the book. But it's not quite right to think about it just as a cycle like this, because it's actually more of a downward spiral, right? I mean, you keep going, this cycle keeps continuing, but as you move through the book, the violence, the things that people do to each other when they move away from God just gets more and more horrific. And the judges themselves become more and more flawed as people. And the deliverance that they sort of raise up for the people becomes less and less effective. So yes, the cycle is going on, but we're going down in this downward spiral. And the book ends. The book of Judges ends with some of the most difficult things to read in the entire Bible. I mean, it is just unimaginable violence and brutality, and the ending is just so bleak. So who's excited about this study? Because this is where we're going for the next few weeks. We're looking at the book of Judges and the lessons that it has for us. And I actually am excited about this. I'm excited about this study and digging into this for a number of reasons. One, again, like I said, even though this book was written 3,000 years ago, I think more than a lot of other books in the Bible, it really does speak into our world and the moment that we are living in. Right? Think about this week. I mean, think about what happened in Las Vegas. We know what it is like to live in a world where the broken decisions of other people hurt others, where we have to live with the consequences of that, where we wake up in the middle of the night and say, is it going to happen at my kid's school next or the concert I go to next, right? We live with that kind of uncertainty that this sinful, broken violence generates in our life. We understand what their world was like. And that's why it can speak so powerfully to us and to our world today and our experience today. And I think that there's a number of things that the book of Judges really does remind us of. Like, first of all, when we read through the book and we see sort of the violence that people do to each other, the fact that when people turn their back on God, it just really does remind us that there are consequences when we do that. When people turn their back on God and go their own way, there are consequences for that. I mean, if we stop and think about it, we kind of relate in some ways to the book of Judges and to the people at this time. I mean, all of us, if we're really being honest with ourselves, we see ourselves in some parts of this story. We can look at decisions that we make or areas of our life where we say, yeah, I'm kind of faithful but flawed over in this thing over here. And all of us know what it's like when things are going well to say, I'm not sure I really need to depend on God right now. I know that the Lord's Prayer says, give us today our daily bread, but I got an extra loaf of bread in the closet. I'm pretty good at taking care of myself. Right? We all can fall into this trap of drifting away from God. It is so, so easy in this life to get caught up in the culture around us, to get caught up with the way things are talked about in the world around us, the other influences around us, and turn our back on God. And what the book of Judges reminds us of is that when we do that, there are consequences. Not just for us, but for the people around us, the people we love, for society at large, because sin always has consequences. And that's why in just a few moments when we're going to take communion, we really have a great opportunity to kind of stop and reflect on our own lives. To think, okay, God, where do I see myself fitting into this story? It comes to the book of Judges. Where are there some areas where maybe I am more flawed than faithful? God, are there areas where I have turned my back on you because things are going well and I'm kind of going on my own? And in just a few minutes when we take communion, we'll have an opportunity to stop before we take those elements and really reflect and just say, God, where am I in this story? And if I'm not where I need to be, what steps do I need to take to try to get back to where you want me to be? And I think it's just critically important for all of us on a regular basis to stop and reflect and ask these kinds of questions. Because even if we've been following Jesus for a long time, the simple truth is that we are more broken than we're ever going to know. Right? You, me, all of us, we are more broken than we are ever going to know. But that is not the end of the story. Right? Because we are also more loved than we can ever imagine. And that's really what we remember, what we celebrate in communion. Right? When we take the cup, when we take the bread, we're reminded that the love of God is here for us. It is always available for us. And I think that's the other great lesson that you pull from the book of Judges, and when you read through it, is that the book of Judges reminds us that God's grace trumps everything. Eventually, it triumphs over everything, including the brokenness of this world, including our own stupidity, our own thoughtlessness, our own sinfulness, and the ways that we damage ourselves and other people. But one of the lessons that we get when we read through the book of Judges is that we are reminded that God has not given up on us, and he has not given up on this world, no matter how bleak the headlines are, or no matter how lost we may feel in different moments of our own lives. So what I want to encourage you to do as we take communion together is just ask yourself the question, what do you need to do with this good news? Because this is good news. Again, when we have the cup, when we have the bread, it's an opportunity to stop and reflect on the sacrifice that God made for us. The sacrifice that really happened on the cross that I think everything in the book of Judges points to. Because when you read through the book of Judges, one of the messages you get over and over again is that we are broken people. And there's crazy stuff that happens in this book. But every crazy character and horrible action, what it does is it just points us towards the absolute need that we have for the cross. It reminds us that ultimately there is no human judge who is going to be able to save us. That ultimately our only hope is found in the sacrifice that God did when he came and died in the person of Jesus on the cross for us. And that as we can only move forward when we think about the power of the Holy Spirit that is now given to us because of what God did. So in just a moment, I'm going to pray. And then the communion stewards are going to come forward. We'll pass the trays, and I would encourage you to just take the bread and take the cup. And then just take a moment before you take communion and just stop and ask, God, what do I need to do with what I've heard today? Where am I in this story? And if I'm not where I need to be, what does it look like through the bread and the cup to let your love and your grace and power come into my life in such a way that I get back on track, that I move back into this? I encourage you to use this time and reflect. If you choose not to take communion with us this morning for any reason, that is totally fine. Just let the tray pass as it goes by. But I would encourage all of us to take this time and really reflect on the central truth that we see in the book of Judges, which is that God has not and God will not ever give up on you, and that his love and his grace is always available to you. So I would encourage you to keep that in mind. Let's pray. God, thank you. I think for the book of Judges. It's a difficult book to read. You look at some of these stories and you're just appalled at what people can do to other people, people who are our brothers and sisters, and yet we treat them in these ways. And God, I'm grateful though that this book is there because it points us to our need for you, and it reminds us that ultimately you did provide a solution for this problem, for the violence that is at the heart of each of us, the brokenness that is at the heart of each of us. And God, the answer to that problem was not us doing more or working harder or trying more. The answer to that problem was you, because of your incredible love for us, sending your Son to take our place. And God, we believe that through the life and the death and the resurrection of your Son, Jesus Christ, we have the opportunity through receiving that grace to be put back in a right relationship with you. So God, as we do this today, as we stop and as we reflect, we just pray that you would open our eyes to concrete and practical steps that we might take today and this week to access more of your grace and love, to make some decisions if we're not where we need to be, to move back closer to you, to step back more into the center of your will. God, open our eyes to the very real areas where we are faithful but flawed, and help us understand what it means to let your power kind of change the balance of those terms so that we can live faithfully for you. Amen.